Chapter 1. The Last String. Just one more. Even as I spoke the words, I could scarcely believe them. I slid my hand across the scaly, gray-brown bark of the rowan tree whose massive roots encircled me, feeling the gentle slopes and curves of the living wood. In one hollow, as deep as a large bowl, sat some of the tools I had been using over the past several months. A stone hammer, a wedge of iron, 3 filing rods of different textures, and a carving knife no bigger than my little finger. I reached past them, past the knob root that served as my hanging rack for my larger saws, to the thin shelf of bark that had so recently held all 8 strings. 8 strings, each one cured, stretched, and finally serenaded under the full autumn moon, according to an ancient tradition. Thankfully, my mentor, Capri, had devoted weeks before that night to helping me learn all the intricate verses and melodies. Even so, the moon had nearly set before I finally sang every one of them correctly and in the right order. Now 7 of the strings gleamed on the little instrument propped on the root beside me. Grasping the last remaining string, the smallest of the lot, I brought it closer. As I twirled it slowly, its ends twisted and swayed, alive almost, like the tongue of someone on the very verge of speaking. Late afternoon light played on the string, making it shine as golden as the autumn leaves speckling the grass at the base of the rowan tree. It felt surprisingly heavy, given its short length, yet as flexible as the breeze itself. Gently, I draped it on a cluster of dark red berries hanging from one of the rowan's lower boughs. Turning back to the instrument, I inserted the last 2 knobs, carved from the same branch of hawthorn as the others, whose month-long kiln drying had ended only yesterday. Rubbing against the oaken soundboard, the knobs squeaked ever so slightly. At last, I retrieved the string. After tying the 7 loops of a wizard's knot on each of the 2 knobs, I began twisting, one to the right and the other to the left. Gradually, the string tightened, strengthening out like a wind-blown banner. Before it had grown too tight, I stopped. Now all that was remained was to insert the bridge and play. Leaning back against the trunk of the rowan, I gazed at my handiwork. It was a psaltery shaped something like a tiny harp, but with a bow soundboard behind all the strings. I lifted it off the root, steadying it admirably. Though it was barely as big as my open hand, it seemed to me as grand as a newborn star. My own instrument, made with my own hands. I ran my finger along the strip of ash inlaid at the top of the frame. This would be much more than a source of music, I knew. Unless, of course, I had bungled any of the steps in making it. Or, much worse, unless... I drew a slow, unsteady breath. Unless I lacked the one thing Capri couldn't teach me, the one thing he couldn't even describe, what he could only call the essential core of a wizard. For as he had so often reminded me, the making of a wizard's first instrument was a sacred tradition, marking a gifted youth's coming of age. If the process succeeded, when the time finally came to play the instrument, it would release its own music, and, simultaneously, an entirely new level of the youth's own magic. And if the process didn't succeed, I set down the psaltery. The strings jangled softly as the soundboard again touched the burly roots of the tree. Among these very roots, Finkyra's most famous wielders of magic, including my legendary father, Tuatha, had cobbled their own first instruments. Hence the tree's name, written into many a ballad and a tale, the cobbler's rowan. Placing my hand over a rounded knob of bark, I listened for the pulse of life within the great tree. The slow, swelling rhythm of roots plunging deeper and branches reaching higher, of thousands of leaves melting from green to gold, of the tree itself breathing, inhaling life and death, and the mysterious bonds connecting both. The cobbler's rowan had continued to stand through many storms, many centuries, and many wizards. Did it know even now, I wondered, whether my psaltery would really work? Lifting my gaze, I surveyed the hills of Druma Wood, each one as round as the back of a running deer. Autumn hues shone scarlet, orange, yellow, and brown. Brightly plumed birds lifted out of the branches, chattering and cooing, while spirals of mist rose from hidden swamps. I could hear, weaving with the breeze, the continuous tumble of a waterfall. This forest, wilder than any place I had ever known, was truly the heart of Finkyra. It was the place I had wandered after washing ashore on the island, and the first place I had ever really felt my own roots sinking deeply. I smiled, seeing my staff leaning against the rowan's trunk. That, too, had been a gift of this forest, as its spicy scent of hemlock reminded me constantly. Whatever elements of real magic that I possessed, outside of a few simple skills such as my second sight, which had come to me after I lost the use of my eyes, and my sword with some magic of its own, resided within the gnarled wood of that staff. As did so much more, for my staff had, somehow, been touched by the power of Tuatha himself. He had reached out of the ages, out of the grave, to place his own magic within its shaft. Even with the blurred edges of my vision, I could make out the symbols carved upon it, symbols of the powers that I yearned to master fully, leaping between places and possibly even times, changing from one form into another, binding not just a broken bone but a broken spirit as well, and all the rest. Perhaps, just perhaps, the psaltery would take on similar powers. Was it possible? Powers that I could wield on behalf of all of Inkyra's people, with wisdoms and grace not seen since the days of my grandfather? I took a deep breath. Carefully, I lifted the little instrument in my hands, then slid the oaken bridge under the strings. A snap of my wrist, and it stood in place. I exhaled, knowing that the moment, my moment, was very near.